centuries, and so many of our practices are rooted in the earliest practices of our faith. And we tend to sometimes think that the legitimate expression of being a Christian, or the most legitimate expression of being a Christian, is rooted in the practices that we came up in. So whatever our church did when we were a child, that's what we believe is the way church is supposed to be. That's legitimate. Everything else is suspicious. And one of the biggest things that we can learn as practicing Christians is that the practice of Christianity, that the practicing of the Christian faith, it didn't begin with you. It didn't begin with your generation. It didn't begin with your grandmama them. It didn't begin with your church. As wonderful as your church may have been, this church is 135 years old. This year it'll be 136 years old. The Christian faith has been around for 2,000 years. A person who can do the math knows that's a small percentage related to the length of time that people have been attempting to follow in the way of Jesus Christ. And so there are a lot of practices that are very, 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 very old. And Lent is one of those very old practices. Tonight, I want to talk through the significance of the week that we are in. It's a week that every Christian ought to observe, be mindful of, to walk through in a serious way to the place of celebration. This is Passion Week. It's Passion Week. And so I want to just give an overview of Passion Week so that we understand as Christians why this week is a week. Why, when you drive through town, will you see crosses draped in purple? Why is there a buzz about what's happening? A lot of churches are having services all week long. There are events for children on Saturday. And so what is the significance? Number one, Passion Week is the 8-day period leading to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so we go from Sunday to Sunday, Passion Week. So this past Sunday, if you were in the sanctuary, you saw they had palms, because it was Palm Sunday. It was the triumphal entry of Jesus. Now, the triumphal entry of Jesus is not something that's just in your Bible. It is a historical fact. So a lot of times people argue about, the historicity of these events. I saw something online the other day raising questions about, actually saying that Jesus wasn't a real person, that Jesus was just a character in Scripture. And that always lets me know that a person hasn't studied deeply enough. Because you may not be a Christian. You ain't got to be a Christian. But one thing that is not a point of argumentation is whether or not Jesus was a real human being. How do we know? We know because there were scholars and there were historians from antiquity who stood outside of the Christian faith but gave commentary about how people responded to this Jesus guy of Nazareth, and even gave historical details about Jesus. So what we know of Jesus, what we know about Bethlehem and Nazareth and Jerusalem and Judea, yeah, we learn a lot of it. The Bible tells us so. But those who are really serious about the faith know that we look even outside of the Bible to understand the historical realities that are associated with Jesus Christ. So Jesus wasn't just a character in the Bible. He was a real human being who was crucified by the Roman government in the year 33 AD. That's just a fact, all right? Christian, not Christian, not. And so the events of Passion Week were historical facts. So we begin on Palm Sunday, we end up on Resurrection Day. Number two, Christians have observed Passion Week also known as Holy Week, since the earliest centuries of the church, likely as early as the 2nd or 3rd century AD. Remember, the issue with Christians the early Christians is that they thought Jesus was coming back tomorrow. So they really, were convinced and convicted that Jesus was on his way back, and so they were just getting ready. So Paul said, don't marry because Jesus is coming back. They said, just go to church, pray, read your Bible, because Jesus is coming back tomorrow. This is the problem. Folks started dying, and Jesus hadn't made it back yet. So the church went from one generation to a second generation, to a third generation. So what began to happen? They had to start putting down the eyewitness testimony of what happened while Jesus walked the earth. That's what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is. That's why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, though they are the first books in the New Testament, they are not the oldest book. They are not the oldest books in the New Testament. Does that make sense to you? 1 Thessalonians is the oldest book in the New Testament. We get Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Actually, we get Mark, Matthew, Luke, John later as Christians are attempting to give the story to the next generation. Now, what else do Christians give to the next generation? They give practices. They give ways of participating in the way of Jesus Christ. So it's what we know as tradition. Say that with me, tradition. Now, tradition sometimes gets a bad rap, but it's not a bad thing, because tradition is what helps you remain connected even when you may not want to be connected. It's what keeps us in the flow when we are at risk of being pulled out of the flow. It's why the Christians, they started attending church every Sunday morning. Why did they choose Sunday morning? Huh? Sabbath? No. Remember, Sabbath was Saturday.
First day of the week.
First day of the week? No. Why did they choose Sunday? Huh? No, ma'am. Jesus rested on the Sabbath when you read the Gospels. Why? Huh? When he rose. So the earliest Christians started having Christian worship. They call it the Lord's Day on Sunday to do one thing: commemorate every single Sunday when Jesus rose from the grave. Why do we still have church on Sunday morning? Because it is rooted in that very tradition. We show up just to honor the fact that it was on a Sunday morning in the year AD 33 that Jesus Christ rose from the grave. It's our tradition. We're participating in the way of Christ. The earliest Christians said we ought not ever forget the passion and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. You ought to remember it every single week. And if you grew up like me, my pastor every single Sunday said, one dark Friday, Jesus died. But early, it didn't matter what else he was preaching about. He was going to say that one line because that's why the Christians. So it's about participating in the tradition. They also had other traditions, Lent and Advent, in order to remember those important dates of the church. 3, it's important that Christians make observing Passion Week a priority. This is why it's important. 1, it deepens our understanding of the work of Christ. So if you call yourself a Christian, you ought to be able to understand and explain Passion Week. Now, you may not know the intricacies of Leviticus or Numbers or Deuteronomy, but you need to understand what happens over this 8-day period and why it is so important to you and to me. So it deepens our understanding of the work of Christ. 2, it encourages spiritual reflection and renewal. Palm Sunday is important to understand because we all will have a point, a day, a period where people will celebrate us. Palm Sunday says, don't get too high because folks say Hosanna on Sunday. Because by Friday, there was another group of people saying, crucify him. Tables turn, things change, God doesn't. Good Friday teaches us that as bad as things may get, bad doesn't have the last word. Sunday's coming. The cross is our plus sign. Thursday teaches us about servanthood. And so it's important to understand it gives us spiritual reflection and renewal. 3, Passion Week connects us with believers across the globe. Do you know this very week, people who are on the other side of the world are observing and participating in this week? They're doing the very same thing that you're doing. So it's not just folk in Louisville doing it. It's folk everywhere doing it. Because Jesus died for the sins of Louisville. No, for the whole wide world. And so all people who are connected to Jesus Christ, this week we pause to celebrate that fact. And then 4, it affirms the hope of the resurrection. All right, so let's get into Palm Sunday, day 1. Let's go to Matthew 21. Matthew 21, verses 1 through 11. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there with her colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, tell them that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away." This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. "Say to the daughter of Zion, see your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt, placed their cloaks on them, and Jesus sat on them. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed him shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest." When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" The crowds answered, "This is Jesus the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." Now, why is this important? Conquering kings and warriors would often have these triumphal entries, these parades. Jesus establishes his kingship and his lordship by riding in as he would a king, but he flips it and reverses it. He does not ride on a steed, he rides on a donkey. So, what's the significance? Palm Sunday reveals that Jesus as the promised king. He is the king of, at his birth, what do we sing? King of kings, Lord of lords. Yep, we say that at his birth. "And he shall be a wonderful counselor, mighty God, Prince of Peace, everlasting Father." We say that on his birth, at his birth. It was at the triumphal entry that Jesus steps into his kingship as the promised king. But Jesus is a different kind of king. He is one who brings peace, not war. That's why we call him, that's why Isaiah called him the Prince of Peace, because Jesus comes to bring peace. That's the significance of Palm Sunday. Now you step out of Palm Sunday. I don't know what happens between the triumphal entry and Monday. Maybe Jesus and the disciples went to Popeyes and got a 2-piece and a biscuit. We don't know what happened. But on Monday, they go to the temple. Now remember, this is a great festival. This is a great festival. It's called Passover. Passover was like, I was about to say Freaknik, but to use a better example, some of y'all remember that, don't you? Yeah, they had a really interesting documentary about that. They did. You was in New Orleans at the time? New York at that time. Yeah, I told my dad called me while I was watching it, and I told him what I was watching. He said, "Oh, look for me on there." I said, "That's not something you want to be proud of." I don't think if you own there, we're not going to tell nobody, right? But what's another better example? Essence, well, kind of, sort of. Essence is, that's somebody shaking their head. That's not. Okay, y'all know a festival. Y'all know what a festival is, right? It don't really hit right. It don't really hit right. Y'all see I don't attend very many festivals. I'm trying to make this live for you. Coachella? No. Yep. Well, I don't know. See, we got too many debates. So I'm going to stick with my first one, Freaknik. And now why is it important? It was a festival and people spontaneously came from all around. Young people, they traveled and descended on Atlanta, and it was a great big party all over the city. The reason it's different from Coachella because you got to pay and have a lot of money to go to Coachella. It's different from the jazz festivals because you got to pay to get in. This Passover festival wasn't quite the same. It was a festival where everybody came, you got in where you fit in, you stayed with your peoples, you did what your money could afford. Right, so I'm not, y'all, do y'all understand the parallel? You did what you could afford. Now, take the Freaknik out of it, put a religious festival in it. Everybody comes on their own dime, get in where they fit in, do what their money can afford. It's a religious festival, so they go to the temple, and when you go to the temple, what are you trying to do? Make a sacrifice. What do you need to make a sacrifice in AD 33? An animal. Because you want to sacrifice the animal. Here's the thing. I have come all the way from my home to this festival, and I could not bring animals with me. So there was a place in the temple called the money changers table where you could buy an animal for sacrifice. Here was the problem. They exploited and they preyed on the travelers. They jacked up the prices of the animals. They knew the people had traveled all this way. They wanted to make a sacrifice. And so they did just what vendors do at concerts, right? They jacked the prices way up. And Jesus became angry. Why did he become angry?
Because they were cheating people.
Because they were cheating people. Because they were preying on people. Because they were predatory merchants. Is that making sense to you? Yeah. That is the backdrop of what happens on Monday. Let's go to Matthew 21, verse 12. You there? Jesus entered the temple area, drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling what? Doves. Why are they selling doves or pigeons?
Because they couldn't afford the
They needed something to sacrifice. So they were getting their hustle on in God's house. That's why the next line comes. Are you ready? Jesus entered the temple. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. It is written, he said to them, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of thieves, a den of robbers. What is he saying? He's saying exploitation and getting your hustle on should not happen in the house of God. Beyond that, exploitation ought not happen in the house of God. He is saying that God's house ought always be a house of prayer, a house of hope, a house of deliverance, a house of healing. It ought not be a place where people have to be concerned with being taken advantage of. That was the significance of Monday. Now, many of you know, if you've been in church as long as I have, you know that there used to be a rule about selling in church, right? And that was based in this passage. This passage is not necessarily about selling in church, it's about exploitation in church. And that's where the application of that passage extends far wider than paying $10 for a plate of food. It is about when we do things in the name of God that hurts and exploits people. That's what made Jesus angry. That's why he turned over the table. So on Monday, we have the cleansing of the temple. On Holy Monday, Jesus clears out the temple courts, driving out those who turn, here it is, worship into profit. Turn worship into profit. Yes, sir. Hmm? So was the motives of it? Ain't total judgment in the Old Testament a substitute? Yeah, it was a sacrifice. The issue was not the sacrifice. The issue was not even the selling of the turtle doves. The issue was jacking up the prices, exploiting the travelers who were coming in order to make a profit off of people who were just trying to worship. The significance. On Holy Monday, Jesus shows his passion for pure worship and the holiness of God's house. He shows his passion for pure worship and the holiness of God's house. I think I better say this. We have got to be careful in our contemporary age of treating God's house like it's your house. Well, we come into God's house like it's any other building. We say anything, we do anything, we treat people any kind of way. We don't have any reverence for God or God's people or God's house. Remember, God's house ought not be handled like anybody else's house. And we've got to always be thoughtful. We've got to always be thoughtful about how we allow ourselves to engage and to how we act, how the position of our hearts, how we treat people in God's house, and even how we treat God's house itself. And we've come over my lifetime real far. You know, I was trained in that old school church. You better not go to the pulpit. Better not touch the Lord's Supper table. You know, there was a certain way that you came dressed to church, not for other people, but because it was holy ground. Now, some of that stuff was real strict, but it taught us to have a high regard for the things of God. My fear is now that we have reduced things so low that we're not raising our children with a consciousness that there's a difference between God's house and our house. And I don't know why. Because we don't treat the courtroom like we treat our house.
That's right. You come in there, I make you take your head off.
Sister Reverend Lex said, you come in there, I make you take your hat off. Yeah, I know you will.
That's right.
You know, you got it. You can't do anything. And, you know, so we ought to honor God's house. Day 3. Giving our kids, iPads and earphones to sit up in church. And then they get up and we mad because they don't want to come to church. And, well, you ain't put church in them. You bring them to church and then you put them. Now, we have children who have different needs. We have a place for them called a children's church, a nursery, so that they can develop a relationship with God on their terms, on their level, right? We've got to be careful with how we do things in God's house. All right, I'll get off that. 3, there's the day of teaching and confrontation. Matthew 21, verse 23. You there? On Tuesday, Jesus did a bunch of teaching. I'm going to start at verse at 23. Jesus entered the temple courts, and while he was teaching, the chief priest and the elders of the people came to him. By what authority are you doing these things? They asked. And who gave you this authority? Jesus replied, I will ask you one question. If you answer me, I'll tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. John's baptism, where did it come from? Was it from heaven or from men? They discussed it among themselves and asked, if we say from heaven, he will ask, then why didn't you believe him? But if we say from men, we were afraid of the people, for they all hold that John was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, we don't know. Then he said, neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things. Then he launches into parables. So there is the parable of the two sons. He has the parable of the tenants. And then if you go to chapter 22, you'll find the parable of the wedding banquet. He goes through all of these paces of teaching between chapters 21 and 24 because he spent all day all day Tuesday on Passion Week teaching and confronting the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So what's on Holy Tuesday? Jesus debates religious leaders, teaches in parables, and warns about hypocrisy and the end times. What's the significance? On Holy Tuesday, Jesus exposes the emptiness of religion without heart and prepares his disciples for what's to come. And so when you read through those parables, when you read through those teachings, Jesus is challenging those who he teaches to get their hearts right with God and to prepare for the coming crucifixion and resurrection. He told them what the end of the story was going to be, and they wasn't listening. They were not mindful they wasn't picking up what he was laying down. Day 4 on Wednesday is the day that the betrayal plot begins. Matthew 26. Let me go back because I don't want anybody to feel like I'm picking on them. And so I want to say something. To make sure I nuance it, okay? Y'all okay? So y'all think with me. Reverend Les said, I make them take off my hat in court. The men. Because that was what? What's that? Respect, reverence. All right. So, where did you learn that? Home, church, military. What's that? Parents. Okay. All right. So, we live in a day where there are people who didn't go to the military, didn't learn it at church, didn't have parents to teach it, and yet they come to church with varying degrees of understanding of the protocols and practices that we have often held civically and religiously. So we've got to understand that. And so we need to understand that so that we understand why people do what they do. Some people just don't have the training. Some people, too, are just iconoclast. So they feel like they're going to wear their hat in the church because ain't nothing in the Bible that says you can't wear your hat. Right? I had a conversation with a guy who went to his home church, and the usher told him to take off his hat. He got mad, said it wasn't in the Bible. And so I just said, well, man, why? He put it on Facebook, so I messaged him. I said, man, why you mad about that? What's and he just beat the point. It wasn't nothing in the Bible, and these church people come up with all these rules, and God ain't concerned about what's on your head. He's concerned about what's in your heart, and I should be able to go, and I should be able to worship. And he was right. But I thought he was also wrong because I had a mama and a daddy who said, take off your hat.
Right. Respect.
In the building, and it didn't matter what building.
Right.
Like if you went to a restaurant, you took off your hat, right? So here is what we need to know, that social mores shift over time. Things become acceptable that were not acceptable in previous generations. Some of you women are old enough to remember where you would not step foot in a church on a Sunday morning without a skirt and your hosiery, them stockings, right? I don't think people even wear stockings no more. Y'all be running around here with so many bare legs. I don't even think they don't sell knee highs at Walgreens no more. My grandma, they put up, who does? I know I'm blessed gets on you, just out of order. My grandma would get them knee highs from Walgreens and that little, it wasn't a ball, but it was, and she'd put them up. Because you didn't come to church showing your legs. That has shifted, hasn't it? I remember when some churches actually had a sign up on the wall that says, "Women, no pants allowed." Yeah. And there was a day where if a woman wore pants to church, she would be sent home. Baby, go on, you can't come in here with them pants on. Yeah. Now, mores shift. What am I saying? I'm saying that we've got to be, this is a place where we've got to exercise a lot of grace. We've got to exercise a lot of grace because there is so much difference with things that people find to be appropriate and what they find to be important. And the devil will exploit those differences in order to keep people out of church. Does that make sense? So I say that to you, and I want to put that out in the air because I don't want you to see a young man to come to church. And a young man will come to church on Sunday with a hat on. He'll be here Sunday. Don't say a word to him. Hug him. Thank him for coming, because we run people away. Well, you ain't supposed to have that hat on in the church. And then, she asked, when do we start teaching? Well, we've got to teach once we establish relationship. Because it's not until you establish a relationship with people that they are even open to hearing you. Two, what I found is a lot of times folk are unsure about coming into the space anyways. Going back to Matthew 21, sometimes sacred space can be the site of hurt and trauma. So don't think that everybody who comes into church has had a good experience with the church. Sometimes, I would wager, every single Sunday that people come into this sanctuary, there is at least one somebody who is trying God and church again. And so something as simple as a hat ain't worth it. There was a guy, he came, sat on the front row, he had on his hat, and I guess I was looking over there. I don't know that I was looking at him, but he thought I was looking at him. No, he didn't take it off. But he sent me a message. And he said, tell your pastor, I saw him looking at me. I know I had my hat on, but I didn't get to get a haircut before I came to church. And I wanted to come to church anyways. And I sent a message back to that brother and said, I wasn't looking at you. And you come anytime. I was just glad you in the house. What's most important? To be in the house and your heart is in the house as well? Or to look the part, but your heart is outside? Because, we also got some folk who come to church and they be watching the basketball game on their phone or the football. They here, but they ain't here. Does that make sense to you? So I want to say that as we talk about what is appropriate and what is not appropriate in church, let's hold our rearing and maybe what we are convicted is appropriate in church. Let's hold that intention with all the other stuff that's out there and how different people show up in this space and let's just make an agreement to be glad they're in the space. Because the last thing we want to do is be chasing young women around talking about, girl, you need to put on some stockings before you come in here on the first. We don't want to be that kind of church. We don't want to be, it's sundress season.
Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord.
And some of y'all gonna spend all summer long, look at her. Huh? I know, she said it's hard for some of us old folk. I get it, but the reason why I'm having this conversation is because I want to put old folk and young folk up on game. And I don't want you to be used as a tool of the enemy to push some young person out of church. Because again, what you consider appropriate and what somebody else considers appropriate are two very different things. It's two very different things. And who is to say who's right and who's wrong?
If I can see your soul, you're wrong.
If you can see your soul, Lord have mercy. She said, if I can see your soul, you're wrong. You gotta look away. You just gotta look away. Because if we don't, and that can be it can be Reverend Letty saying, Pastor, I know, I get it. But what are we gonna do? What are we gonna do?
It's too far gone anyway.
It's too far gone. We live in a sheen culture. Y'all know what I'm talking about. In a Fashion Nova culture. It's the I'm not hating. I'm not hating on Sheen. I'm not hating on Fashion Nova. I just think we gotta understand when we talk about what's appropriate in church now that it's not the same today as it was 30 years ago. And some of y'all are to blame for it. You got Sister Coleman over here. She done stopped wearing stockings. You got all y'all that done stopped wearing slips. And don't nobody wear slips no more. They wore slips just 20 years ago, just 25 years. Who said we didn't have to wear slips no more?
Mm-hmm. And I understand that, but as a younger person, like as young now, but when I started going to church consistently, I felt that was what I was supposed to do,
Mm-hmm.
abide by what I needed to do
Mm-hmm.
instead of focusing more on what I'm supposed to get out of
Mm-hmm.
that. And I think that, and especially the way young people think, they think the world is very fluid
Mm-hmm.
in all of their thoughts, and so I think it's when someone wants to come to church, when we start to apply some of those expectations
Mm-hmm.
on them, in my opinion, I feel like it's less Christian-like
Mm-hmm.
for us to do that, because what makes us any better?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because we're all flawed. Every single one of us, we're all flawed. And I'll tell you, there was a gentleman, I assume, because I think I saw him when I ushered, that he went on Facebook and made a big old post about this hat thing, because he came to church here on a Sunday, and I didn't comment. I was just like,
Mm-hmm.
But it's like now, it's like, will he ever come back?
Mm-hmm.
Because some guys had told him not to wear his hat.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And it's just like he's trying to get close to God or
Mm-hmm.
have a relationship, or whatever he was seeking that day.
Mm-hmm.
The hat situation became more important.
Right.
And probably wiped out all of his
Mm-hmm.
whatever he thought he was going to get that day has been deterred because of that situation that happened as soon as he couldn't even get in the sanctuary
Mm-hmm.
before there was an issue.
Yep.
So I think over time, as we continue just to love on people and welcome them in, they'll adapt to what the expectation is.
And some of them,
And maybe
You're right. Some of them will adapt.
Yes.
Some of them will never adapt.
Some right never.
And so so what I've got to always do is remember my job. And my job is not a dress code enforcer. My job is to preach the gospel. My job is to love people. My job is to invite people into a relationship with Jesus Christ. And as pastor, I get to walk with some of these people. And some of them, they may not ever quite. Y'all know I am anti-marijuana. All my friends laugh at me because they think that is just so old of me. I'm against it. I think it's bad for your health. I think it's bad for your brain. I got too many relatives who've been smoking it for so long that you can't pay me to believe that you don't lose brain cells smoking that reefer. Now, y'all know how I feel about it, but I got some members who imbibe regularly and deeply. They still my members. And I'm not going to police them on that. I'm going to be their pastor. I'm going to walk with them. I'm going to give them Jesus. When they eat too much of the brownie and have to go to the emergency room to have their stomach pumped, and their mama called me crying, talking about, I'm going to go down there to the hospital and pray and say, I told you, stay away from that. Right. So, yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
Now, I had a mother that said, when you come to church, you change.
Mm-hmm.
And anytime you want something that distracts someone else
Mm-hmm.
from getting the message, that's not pleasing to God. You see, the mothers used to tell people when they came in, so how they need to church.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why, we love doing it.
Well, you have a lot less women who want to be mothers now. So that might be a part of the transition. But also that goes back to the same thing. Because one, there's a lot in these conversations that's rooted in misogyny, in sexism. We have a lot of, pretty much the only rule for men was don't wear your hat in the building. Back when I was growing up, you couldn't have your neck showing. You had to have a tie on, or you either had to have your collar buttoned up. I don't know what that was about. But those were the rules. But women, they had to be dressed a certain way, had to be fully covered up, skirt had to be a certain length. Everything was policed. And what did they say? Because if you wear something that is, might distract somebody else, you're in the wrong. Well, there are so many fallacies with that statement. Number one, if she fine enough, she can have on a hijab and may get some of our attention, right? So and sometimes what I have found as pastor of the church is it is often the women who get beside themselves on what young women are wearing, because old women come to church inappropriate too. Old enough to be on the mother's board, yet nobody says nothing about them with they back out. Nobody says nothing to them. Y'all know I'm telling the honest to God truth. So we need to be, before we correct anybody, we need to have some really honest interrogation about where did we get this stuff from? Where did they get this stuff from? Is it really what God is concerned about? Why am I sitting in church looking at what somebody else has on? Does that say something about them, or does that say something about me? Those are things that we've got to interrogate before we pass some of this stuff down to another generation. And we also have to realize that some things are just downright cultural. It's our culture. It's what we do. If you Baptist, you had a certain way of being. If you were apostolic, you had a certain way of being. If you were Pentecostal, you had a certain way of being. It's our cultural stuff. It don't necessarily make it God stuff. It makes it our stuff. And it is there that the devil can have an in to push people out. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. You're exactly right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. So he talks about church being a training ground. And I think that's true. Church is a training ground, but before you can train, you got to have a relationship. And the relationship has to go both ways. It has to go both ways. One thing that we often make the mistake of doing is meeting people, just like Sister Bridget said, in the vestibule. Take off your hat. Well, I ain't even got in yet. I'm trying to go use the bathroom. You telling me to, and we stop them right there. Number two, we make the mistake of not understanding the differences in generation. So this is a generation, teachers today, I walk to these in these schools, these teachers don't look like the teachers that looked when I was going through school. They look totally different. And you bet not say anything to any of them about it. I wear a suit generally most days, and I wear a suit for a variety of reasons. But when I go out often, people you don't have to dress like that.
Yeah.
You just come to a school building.
Yeah.
Well, I dress the way I dress because that's how I want to show up in the world.
Yeah.
But I'm often deemed as overdressed, whereas 20 years ago, wearing a suit to your professional obligation for a man was just standard. So times have changed, generations have changed. What I'm saying to us is we've got to be aware of the nuances and not be so quick to impose what we were taught onto other people. Because if we did that in this church, when the kids do their Easter speeches, they wouldn't stand right here, they would stand right here. Because you didn't want to go over there. That's where the pastor stood. And if you wasn't called to preach, God was going to strike you down if you went over there. Y'all remember the nurses used to bring water, and nurses, they would go there first step. Scared to death, bringing water. Well, some of that was overkill. So we've got to make sure that we emphasize heart, because that's what God cares about. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. 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 Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the teachers dress like the teenagers, and the teenagers roll out of bed and go to school. Yeah. I think you have to do it bit by bit, relationship by relationship, and realize you're not going to be able to change everybody. Kids who want to wear pajamas to school, they're going to wear pajamas to school. Now, my children ain't wearing no doggone pajamas to school. And so so at the beginning of the year, I just had to draw some boundaries. This is what we do in this household. Well, Daddy, why not everybody? I don't care. I buy the Jordans in this house. I buy the Frosted Flakes in this house. So you're not going to go out of this house in a certain way. There's a shoe that young kids have now. It's an UGG shoe. It is a house shoe. Zoe asked for it for Christmas. I went to the store, and I said, "This look like house shoes." And a woman said, "They are house shoes." But everybody is wearing them out everywhere, going to school like shoes. So Zoe put her feet in them one day, thinking she was going to go to school. I said, "No, ma'am. House shoes are for the house." Right? So I have to police that in my house. I can't police that for your house. And it's the same thing in church. We need to understand that there are some people who are going to come in their hats and in they suits or what have you, and then there are some other people who not, and we need to be okay with that because God is after heart, not all other stuff. All right, let me rush through this. All right, we get to Day 4. On Holy Wednesday, this is significance. We see a contrast between extravagant love, that's Mary's anointing, and bitter betrayal. Jesus begins his march toward the cross knowingly and willingly. The cross did not catch Jesus by surprise. He decided to die. He decided to move in that vein. All right? Day 5, Thursday, the Last Supper in Gethsemane. What's the significance? Maundy Thursday, that's the Thursday before the crucifixion, was a night of humility, love, and deep sorrow. Jesus offers his body and blood as the new covenant. So every first Sunday we do what? Have the Lord's Supper. We have the Lord's Supper because of what happened on Maundy Thursday. Jesus did two things. He washed his disciples' feet. There's a Christian denomination called Primitive Baptist. Primitive Baptists are Primitive Baptists because they are feet-washing Baptists. The Catholic Church has 7 ordinances. One of their ordinances is foot washing. In the Episcopal Church, before you become a bishop, you wash feet. It is because that is what Jesus did on Maundy Thursday. Every communion, we're hearkening back to Maundy Thursday. That's what I mean by tradition. So why do we do things repeatedly? Because we're calling to memory certain things. All right. Friday is the crucifixion. On Good Friday, Jesus is falsely accused. He's beaten. He's crucified. He dies. He carries the weight of the world's sins, both personal and systemic. So when we talk about Jesus dying, Jesus didn't just die for you personally. He did die for you personally, but it's more than that. That's why at the end of time, the entire creation will be redeemed. God is not just coming back for you and me. He's coming back for the whole shebang. Huh? I don't know. He saved them on Noah's Ark. I don't know. We ain't never been to heaven. But he may. But at the consummation of all times, he says there'll be a new heaven and a new earth. Right.
Like seraphims and stuff with animals like creatures. That's what I knew that in Revelation or in Daniel, I believe it was.
That was in Daniel. All right. So the significance of Good Friday, which is the darkest day of Passion Week, it becomes the cornerstone of salvation. So Calvary is the cornerstone of salvation. It's where God takes everything that's wrong and he makes it right. The Lamb of God takes away the sins of the world. Now, Saturday is Silent Saturday. So traditionally for 1,800 years, Christians have been silent on Saturday. You do know Saturday you ain't supposed to talk. Silent Saturday. Why? Why is Silent Saturday silent? Huh? Folks sad. Jesus dead. You don't talk. So in many traditions throughout Christendom over the last 1,800 years, they have a solemn assembly on Good Friday. If you Baptist, you do 7 last words. If you Catholic, you go to the Catholic Church around noon in order to participate in the solemn ceremony of the Passion. And if you go to a Catholic cathedral Friday at noon, at the end, they'll turn off all the lights. They'll drape things in black. And you walk out from that service silent. Why? Jesus is there. It's time of reflection, right? Saturday, Silent Saturday. It's a day of waiting, silence, and grief. And it's important to sit in Silent Saturday every now and then, because what if Jesus were dead? You don't have a hope of salvation. You don't have the gift of the Holy Spirit. You don't have eternal life. What if Jesus is dead? There is no hope that you can overcome your worst experiences. What if Jesus is dead? We ought to live in that, because some of us are so accustomed to Jesus being alive that we overlook how good of a gift it is. And then on Sunday, early Sunday morning, Jesus gets up. Now, the significance. Resurrection Day is the foundation of the Christian faith. Everything that we do, everything that we are, it is because of the resurrection. Because had Jesus died and not gotten up on Sunday morning, he would just been dead. Like the two thieves who were beside him. But because he rose, that's where we find significance, that's where we find meaning. That's how we know that the sacrifice on Friday was an atoning sacrifice, that you and I have no need for bulls and goats and doves. All of that was done at Calvary. We can walk in the newness of life, and we can get out of our tombs of desperation and death because Jesus rose from the grave. So we are a resurrection people. Everything that we do as Christians is rooted in resurrection. The world deals death. That's Good Friday. But Jesus Christ says, I have come that you might have life and have life more abundantly. We are a resurrection people. That's why funerals, we have homegoing celebrations, because we are people of the resurrection. We don't believe that death is the end. Fundamentally, we don't believe that death is the end. Do you know that's why we have cemeteries? Cemeteries was a Christian thing, because they would call it a witness to the resurrection. They would lay you down and wait for Gabriel to blow his trumpet that you may rise in the newness of life. All right? So that is why we are resurrection people. Now, I want you to clarify this one thing, and I'll be done. There are, every year at this time, there's some conversation about, y'all say he died on Friday and 3 days later he got up. Sunday is not 3 days later. So either he got up on Monday, or he died on Thursday, or it's all made up. They said every year, I promise you're going to see it on Facebook in just about a day or two. This is what I want you to know. We live on the Gregorian calendar. In antiquity, in the Gospels, they lived based on the Jewish calendar and the Roman calendar. Days were counted differently in the Jewish tradition. So don't let nobody tell you, oh, they know 3 days. I once heard a preacher say, Jesus got up on Monday, not Sunday. I said, 2,000 years, they done said he got up on Sunday. You get up on one Easter. You didn't study. No, because Jesus was not living based on the Gregorian calendar. He was living on in a time of the Jewish calendar. That is how they were counting the 3 days and 3 nights. I just wanted y'all to know that. So that when somebody say, come to because your cousin's going to come to the Easter dinner. And I can come to church and be like, you going out in that church celebrating Easter. Easter was a pagan holiday, and it wasn't even 3 days. The math don't be mathing. They're going to say all of those types of things. Is Christianity connected to other ancient holidays? Yeah, it happened at the Passover. How do we know when Easter's supposed to be? Do you know that Easter is not like Christmas? Christmas is when? December 25th. It's December 25th every year. When is Mother's Day? Second Sunday in May. When is Father's Day?
Sometime in June.
See, that's a shame. Sometime in June. She said, we don't know, right? Easter is always the Sunday following the Passover, the Paschal feast. It happens every year. So Jewish people on Thursday will have their Seder meals, I should say.